Their new neighbors were living under fake identities since 1980. The moving truck rumbled away, leaving Ellen Whitmore standing on the freshly swept porch of her new home. She crossed her arms against the crisp autumn breeze and let out a sigh that was equal parts relief and apprehension. At 68, this was supposed to be the start of a simpler chapter in life. A quieter existence after decades spent raising children, climbing corporate ladders, and enduring the relentless churn of city living. But as she glanced at the neatly trimmed hedges and unfamiliar street, a pang of unease settled in her chest. Jack emerged from inside, wiping his hands on an old rag. His silver hair caught the late afternoon sunlight, but there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there last year. Retirement had softened him in some ways but hardened others. "What do you think?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "It's nice," Ellen replied, forcing a smile. Nice wasn't quite the word she was searching for. It was quiet, yes, almost too quiet. Their previous neighborhood had buzzed with activity. Kids riding bikes, dogs barking, neighbors chatting over fences. Here, though, it felt like stepping into a painting where time stood still. Even the air seemed heavier, carrying whispers of secrets long buried. As if on cue, a car pulled up to the house next door. Ellen straightened instinctively, curiosity getting the better of her. A man stepped out first, tall and wiry, with sharp features softened slightly by gray stubble. He wore a dark sweater that looked expensive, but somehow out of place in this modest suburban setting. Behind him came a woman, petite and elegant, her silver hair styled impeccably, despite the wind tugging at it. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if every step required careful consideration. "Looks like we've got company," Jack said, nodding toward them. Ellen hesitated before descending the steps, smoothing down her cardigan as she approached the low picket fence separating their yards. "Hello," she called, injecting cheerfulness into her voice. The couple paused, exchanging a glance that lasted just a fraction longer than necessary. Then the man offered a polite smile. "Good afternoon. I'm Frank Harper, and this is my wife, Lila. Welcome to the neighborhood," Lila added, her voice smooth and measured, like someone who'd practiced saying those exact words many times before. Her gaze flickered briefly to Ellen's face before drifting back to the ground. "I'm Ellen Whitmore, and that's my husband, Jack." Ellen gestured toward Jack, who gave a small wave. "We just moved in today." Frank nodded approvingly. "Beautiful home. We did the same a few weeks ago. Thought it was time for a change." "A change?" Jack echoed, tilting his head. "From where?" There was another pause, barely noticeable unless you were paying attention. And Ellen was paying attention. She couldn't help it. Years of navigating boardroom politics had honed her ability to read people. Something about their demeanor, the way they spoke without revealing anything, felt off. "Chicago," Lila finally said, her tone light but her expression guarded. It was becoming rather hectic. Ellen forced another smile, though her instincts prickled. There was no mention of what they'd done in Chicago, no shared anecdotes about adjusting to suburban life. Just vague pleasantries delivered with practiced ease. She wanted to press further, to ask why they chose this particular neighborhood, or how they liked it so far, but something held her back. Perhaps it was the way Frank's eyes lingered on her just a moment too long, as if assessing her motives. "Well, if you need anything, don't hesitate to ask," Ellen said instead, keeping her tone friendly. "We're still figuring things out ourselves." "That's very kind of you," Lila replied, her lips curving upward in a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We'll be sure to let you know." With that, the Harpers excused themselves, disappearing behind their front door with a finality that left Ellen unsettled. She turned to Jack, who was already heading back toward the house. "Did you notice anything strange about them?" she asked once they were inside. Jack shrugged, unbothered. "They seem fine to me. Polite enough." "They're hiding something," Ellen murmured under her breath, more to herself than to him. Jack chuckled, patting her shoulder. "Honey, everyone's hiding something. Doesn't mean it's sinister." Maybe he was right. Maybe she was being overly cautious, projecting her own discomfort with change onto innocent neighbors. Still, as Ellen unpacked boxes later that evening, she found herself glancing out the window more often than she cared to admit, The Harper's house remained dark except for a single light glowing faintly in the upstairs window, a beacon of mystery in an otherwise ordinary night. And somewhere deep down, Ellen knew this quiet move-in marked the beginning of something far more complicated than either she or Jack could have anticipated. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of day that made Ellen feel guilty for staying indoors. She decided to take Max out for a walk, partly to stretch her legs and partly to shake off the lingering unease from yesterday's encounter with the Harpers. The golden retriever bounded ahead of her as they strolled along the edge of their property, his tail wagging furiously at the scent of freshly turned earth near the fence line. "Max, come here," Ellen called, noticing him pawing at something half buried in the dirt. He ignored her, digging with renewed enthusiasm until he unearthed what looked like a soggy piece of cardboard. "What on earth?" She hurried over, pulling him back by his collar before kneeling down to inspect the object. It was a photograph, its edges warped and colors faded, but still legible. As she brushed away the clinging soil, her breath caught. Two people stood in front of a weathered roadside diner, their arms draped casually around each other's shoulders. Despite the decades that had passed since the photo was taken, there was no mistaking who they were: Frank and Lila Harper. Ellen's pulse quickened as she studied the image more closely. They looked younger, much younger, but unmistakably themselves. Frank wore aviator sunglasses perched atop his head, his hair dark and unruly, while Lila sported a floral blouse and high-waisted jeans that screamed 1980s fashion. Behind them loomed a large neon sign reading, "Welcome to Greystone, New Mexico." Her mind raced. What were the odds of finding such a thing in her own backyard? And why would an old photograph of the Harpers be buried here? It didn't make sense. Unless this wasn't just any random spot where someone had discarded a memory. This land must have meant something to them once. Ellen tucked the photograph into her pocket and called Max to her side, her thoughts swirling as they headed back inside. Jack was in the kitchen, sipping coffee and flipping through the local paper. He glanced up when she entered, arching an eyebrow at her distracted expression. "What's got you so worked up?" he asked, setting the mug down. She hesitated, unsure how much to share. Part of her wanted to dismiss the discovery as nothing, a relic from some previous owner, or a coincidence not worth dwelling on. But another part, the part that thrived on puzzles and unanswered questions, couldn't let it go. "I found this," she said, pulling out the photograph and laying it on the counter between them. "In the yard, near the fence." Jack leaned forward, squinting at the image. "Huh, that's weird." "Weird doesn't even begin to cover it," Ellen replied, tapping the photo with her finger. "Look closer. It's Frank and Lila." His eyes widened slightly, and he picked up the picture for a better look. "You're right. It is them. But what are they doing in New Mexico?" "That's exactly what I want to know." Ellen crossed her arms, staring at the image as if willing it to reveal its secrets. "And why was it buried in our yard?" Jack shrugged, though his usual nonchalance seemed strained. "Maybe it belonged to the people who lived here before us. Or maybe the Harpers used to live here years ago and forgot about it." "But they told us they moved in recently," Ellen countered. "Why would they lie about that?" "Maybe they didn't think it mattered," Jack suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. "People move around, Ellen. Not everything has to be a conspiracy." She shot him a look. "Since when did you become so trusting?" He chuckled, raising his hands in mock surrender. Okay. If it'll make you feel better, we can ask them about it." "No," Ellen said firmly. "Not yet. Something tells me they wouldn't appreciate us snooping around their past." Jack frowned, studying her face. "Then what do you suggest we do?" For a moment, Ellen didn't answer. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the Harper's house sat silent and unassuming under the morning sun. There was something about the way the light hit the upstairs window, casting shadows that seemed almost deliberate, as if hiding something beneath the surface. "I think we should find out more about Greystone," she said finally, her voice low but resolute. "If this photo means anything, it starts there." Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You realize this is probably going to lead nowhere, right?" "Probably," Ellen admitted. "But what if it doesn't?" There was a long pause, during which Jack seemed to weigh his options. Finally, he nodded. All right, let's see where this rabbit hole takes us. But don't say I didn't warn you. Ellen allowed herself a small smile, already feeling the thrill of the chase, the faint stirrings of a mystery that refused to be ignored. Whatever secrets lay hidden in Greystone, New Mexico, she intended to uncover them. After all, retirement wasn't supposed to be boring. That night, after Jack had fallen asleep, Ellen sat alone at the kitchen table with her laptop open in front of her. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, but inside, Ellen's focus was razor sharp. She typed Greystone, New Mexico into the search bar and hit enter. The results loaded slowly, each link taunting her with fragments of information. At first, it seemed like any other small town, population dwindling, economy struggling. But then she found it. A grainy black and white photograph accompanied an article from a local newspaper dated October 1985. The headline read, "Tragedy strikes Greystone Diner, 2 missing after fatal robbery and arson." Her breath hitched as she clicked on the link. The page loaded, revealing details that sent a chill down her spine. According to the report, the diner had been targeted late one evening by armed robbers who tied up the staff and patrons before setting the building ablaze. Firefighters arrived too late. The structure was reduced to ash. Among the victims were 2 individuals whose remains were never recovered. A young couple believed to have been sitting near the back booth when the attack occurred. Ellen scrolled further, her heart pounding. Witnesses claimed they saw a man and woman fleeing the scene shortly before the fire erupted, but no concrete descriptions were provided. Law enforcement suspected these 2 might have been accomplices or even masterminds behind the crime, though their identities remained unknown. The case went cold within months, buried under layers of bureaucracy and fading public interest. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen as if waiting for it to offer more answers. Her mind raced, connecting dots she wasn't sure should be connected. Frank and Lila Harper, standing proudly in front of that same diner just years earlier, smiling as if nothing could touch them. Could they have been those missing suspects? Was this why they'd lied about moving recently, and why they now lived next door? A soft whine broke her concentration. Max stood beside her, his warm body pressing against her leg, as if sensing her unease. She reached down absently to scratch behind his ears, trying to steady herself. This was insane, wasn't it? People changed addresses all the time without explanation. There had to be another reason for the photo being buried in her yard. Some mundane explanation she hadn't considered yet, but deep down, she knew better. Something about the Harpers didn't add up, and this discovery only solidified her suspicions. The next morning, Ellen barely touched her breakfast. Jack noticed immediately, frowning over his scrambled eggs. "You're still thinking about that picture, aren't you?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I did some digging last night." His fork clattered onto his plate. "What did you find?" Without a word, she turned her laptop toward him, letting him read the article for himself. His face paled as he scrolled through the text, his jaw tightening noticeably. When he finally looked up, his voice was low and measured. "This doesn't prove anything, Ellen." "It proves enough," she countered, leaning forward. "Think about it, Jack. Why would someone bury a photo of themselves outside our house unless they wanted us to find it, or unless they thought no one ever would?" He rubbed his temples, clearly torn between logic and paranoia. "Even if it is them, what are we supposed to do? Knock on their door and accuse them of arson and murder?" "No," Ellen said firmly. "Not yet, but we need to keep looking. If they really are connected to this, there has to be more evidence somewhere." Jack sighed heavily, shaking his head. "You're playing with fire here, Ellen. These people may not be dangerous, but messing around in their past could make them feel cornered. And cornered people do unpredictable things." "I know," she admitted softly, glancing out the window toward the Harper's house. Their curtains were drawn tight, the windows dark and impenetrable. For a moment, she almost believed Jack, that maybe she was letting her imagination run wild, chasing shadows where none existed. But then she remembered the photograph, the cold efficiency of the article, and the unsettling perfection of the Harper's polite facade. Something wasn't right, and until she uncovered the truth, she wouldn't rest easy. Later that afternoon, while Jack tinkered in the garage, Ellen decided to take another walk, this time circling the block to see if anyone else might shed light on the Harpers' history. She struck up conversations with a few neighbors, feigning casual curiosity about the area. Most shrugged off her questions, claiming ignorance about the couple next door. But Mrs. Henderson, an elderly widow 3 houses down, offered a nugget of intrigue. "Oh yes, I remember hearing something about that property," she said, squinting as if recalling a distant memory. "Years ago, long before you moved in, there was talk of, well, strange comings and goings. Lights on at odd hours, cars pulling in late at night. Nothing ever proved, of course, but it left a bad taste." Ellen thanked her, filing the tidbit away as she returned home. By the time she stepped back inside, her resolve had hardened. Whatever secrets Frank and Lila Harper carried with them, they weren't going to stay buried forever, not if she had anything to say about it. And so beneath the surface of her quiet suburban life, the first cracks began to form. The next day, Ellen decided to dig deeper into the Harpers' mysterious arrival. Armed with a thermos of coffee and a notebook she hadn't used since her days as an executive assistant, she set out under the pretense of getting to know her new neighbors. It wasn't entirely a lie. She did want to get to know them, but her primary goal was far less innocent. Her first stop was Mr. Patel, the cheerful owner of the corner convenience store who seemed to know everyone in the area. He greeted her warmly when she entered, his eyes crinkling behind thick glasses. "Mrs. Whitmore, how are you settling in?" "Just fine, thank you," Ellen replied, offering him a polite smile. She lingered by the counter, pretending to browse a rack of postcards. "Actually, I wanted to ask if you've met our neighbors, the Harpers? They seem quiet." Mr. Patel's brow furrowed slightly as he wiped down the counter. "The Harpers? Can't say I've seen much of them. Quiet folk, like you said. Haven't been in here once as far as I can recall." Ellen nodded thoughtfully. "That's odd. You'd think they'd need groceries or supplies after moving in." "They didn't move in," Mr. Patel corrected, almost absently. "At least, not that anyone saw. One day the house was empty, the next it had their name on the mailbox. Sold off-market, I heard." A chill ran down Ellen's spine. Off-market sales weren't uncommon, but combined with everything else, their evasive behavior, the bare photograph, it felt significant. She thanked Mr. Patel and made her way to the park, where she found the mail carrier unloading packages from his truck. "Excuse me," she called, waving him over. "Do you deliver to the Harpers?" The young man adjusted his cap, nodding. "Sure do. Nice enough folks, I guess. Not much happens over there, though." "No guests? Packages?" Ellen pressed, trying to sound casual. He shook his head. "Nah, just bills and junk mail. Nothing personal. Honestly, I barely see them come or go. Sometimes I wonder if they're even home." Ellen thanked him and continued her rounds, striking up conversations with other longtime residents. Each account added another layer to the mystery. Mrs. Klein, who lived across the street, mentioned that she'd never seen any moving trucks or furniture deliveries at the Harpers' house. "It's like they appeared out of thin air," she said with a nervous laugh. By late afternoon, Ellen had pieced together a troubling picture. The Harpers hadn't moved in, at least not in the traditional sense. Their presence seemed calculated, deliberate, and yet they remained ghosts within their own home, unseen except for brief encounters like the one Ellen and Jack had experienced. Back at the house, Ellen poured herself a glass of iced tea and spread out her notes on the kitchen table. Jack walked in, eyeing the scattered papers skeptically. "What's all this?" "Research," she said simply, tapping the list of observations she'd compiled. "No one remembers seeing them move in. Their house was sold off market. No visitors, no personal mail, just generic junk. Doesn't that strike you as strange?" Jack sighed, pulling out a chair. "It's strange, sure, but people value privacy, Ellen. Maybe they're just recluses. Or maybe they're hiding something," she countered sharply. "Think about it, Jack. Everything points to them wanting to stay invisible. Why would they go to such lengths unless they had something to hide?" He leaned back, rubbing his temples. "Even if they are hiding something, it doesn't mean it's connected to that diner fire. People leave their past behind for lots of reasons. Not all of them criminal." Ellen didn't respond right away. Instead, she stared at the photograph of Frank and Lila standing in front of the Greystone Diner, their smiles frozen in time. There was something haunting about it now, a reminder of lives interrupted, secrets buried. Whether or not the Harpers were directly involved, they clearly carried echoes of that tragedy with them, and those echoes had followed them here. Later that evening, as dusk settled over the neighborhood, Ellen stood by the living room window, watching the Harpers' house. The single upstairs light burned steadily, casting faint shadows against the curtains. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, a figure pacing near the window, but it vanished too quickly to be certain. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, startling her. It was a text from Jack, who was still tinkering in the garage. "You okay? Don't let this consume you." She stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "Too late." Because deep down she knew she couldn't let it go. Whatever truths lay hidden beneath the surface of this quiet suburban life, they were calling to her, and she intended to answer. The invitation came unexpectedly. Lila Harper appeared at their door early one Saturday morning, her smile impeccably polite but lacking warmth. "Good morning, Ellen," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "Frank and I thought it might be nice to invite you both over for coffee." A small gesture of neighborly goodwill. Ellen exchanged a glance with Jack, who raised his eyebrows in silent surprise. They hadn't expected the Harpers to make the first move, especially given how reserved they'd been thus far. Still, Ellen forced a gracious smile. "That sounds lovely. Thank you." Lila nodded approvingly. "Wonderful. Come whenever you're ready. We'll be waiting." As soon as the door closed behind her, Jack turned to Ellen. "Well, that was convenient." "Convenient or calculated?" Ellen muttered under her breath, already heading upstairs to change. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an impromptu social call. Something about Lila's demeanor, the careful precision of her words, felt staged, as if rehearsed. When they arrived at the Harpers' house 20 minutes later, Frank greeted them at the door with a firm handshake and a faintly strained smile. "Welcome," he said, ushering them inside. "Make yourselves comfortable." The interior of the home was immaculate, almost unnervingly so. Every surface gleamed. Every item seemed precisely placed. There were no family photos on the walls, no mementos cluttering the shelves. Just sleek furniture and neutral tones that gave the space an impersonal, almost sterile quality. Lila poured coffee into delicate china cups, her movements deliberate and unhurried. As they sat around the dining table exchanging pleasantries, Ellen found herself studying the Harpers more closely. Despite their polished exteriors, there was tension in the air, an unspoken weight pressing down on the conversation. Frank's eyes darted occasionally toward the kitchen window, while Lila fidgeted subtly with the edge of her napkin. It was then that Ellen noticed something odd. Through the glass panes of the side door leading to the garage, she could see two heavy-duty padlocks securing the garage door from the inside. Her stomach tightened. Why would anyone lock their garage from the inside unless they were trying to keep something or someone out, or perhaps keep something hidden? Before she could think better of it, her gaze lingered a moment too long. Lila followed her line of sight and froze, her hand hovering mid-pour. For a brief second their eyes met, and Ellen saw something flicker in Lila's expression. Fear? Guilt? Whatever it was, it vanished almost instantly, replaced by a practiced calm. "Oh dear," Lila said lightly, setting the coffee pot down with a soft clink. "I hope you don't mind instant. We ran out of fresh grounds yesterday." Ellen blinked, startled by the abrupt change in subject. "Not at all," she replied, forcing a smile, but her mind raced. Lila had caught her looking, and instead of confronting her or offering an explanation, she deflected. It was a classic tactic, one Ellen recognized from years of navigating corporate politics. People only deflected when they had something to hide. After finishing their coffee, the visit ended as politely as it had begun. Frank walked them to the door, thanking them for coming, while Lila lingered in the background, her hands clasped tightly together. As Ellen stepped onto the porch, she glanced back one last time. Lila stood in the doorway, watching them leave with an unreadable expression. For a fleeting moment, Ellen thought she saw Lila's lips part, as if she wanted to say something. But whatever it was remained unspoken. Instead, Lila offered a final nod before closing the door softly behind her. "Well, that was Interesting, Jack remarked once they were safely back in their own kitchen. He reached for the newspaper, clearly eager to put the encounter behind him. But Ellen wasn't ready to let it go. She paced the room, replaying the scene in her mind. The locked garage, Lila's reaction, that split-second hesitation before she changed the subject. She knows we're onto something, Ellen said suddenly, stopping mid-stride. She may even want to talk, but she's scared. Jack lowered the paper, giving her a skeptical look. You're reading way too much into this, Ellen. Maybe they just value their privacy. No, Ellen insisted, shaking her head. It's more than that. Did you see the way she looked at me when I noticed the locks? She panicked, Jack, and then she covered it up. That's not normal behavior. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Even if you're right, and I'm not saying you are, what exactly do you plan to do about it? Ellen hesitated, unsure how to answer. She didn't have a concrete plan, not yet, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't ignore what she'd seen. Whatever secrets lay behind those padlocked doors, they weren't going to stay hidden forever. And deep down, she suspected Lila Harper might hold the key to unlocking them. The following weekend, Jack decided to tackle the overgrown patch of earth along the fence line. Ellen had been distracted all week, her mind consumed by thoughts of the Harpers and their locked garage. He figured a little manual labor might help clear his own head, and maybe distract her from spiraling deeper into conspiracy theories. Armed with a spade and gardening gloves, he worked methodically, turning the soil and pulling weeds. The morning sun warmed his back as he dug, the rhythmic scrape of the shovel against the ground, soothing in its simplicity. For a while, it felt good to focus on something tangible, something that didn't involve unanswered questions or shadowy suspicions. Then the shovel struck something solid. Jack paused, frowning as he knelt to investigate. Brushing away the loose dirt revealed a rusted metal tin, its surface pitted and warped from years underground. Curious, he pried it open with the edge of the spade, revealing a jumble of items inside. Ellen, he called, his voice sharp enough to carry through the open kitchen window. You'd better come see this. She appeared moments later, wiping her hands on a dish towel. What is it? She asked, crouching beside him. He held up the tin, showing her its contents. Several laminated identity cards. A faded passport bearing a photo of a younger Frank Harper, but under a different name, and a delicate gold necklace with a scorched locket dangling from it. Ellen's breath caught as she gingerly picked up the locket, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it. Inside was a tiny photograph of two children, a boy and a girl, no older than 10, smiling brightly at the camera. The image was slightly smudged, but otherwise intact, preserved despite the damage to the locket itself. This can't be a coincidence, Ellen whispered, staring at the picture. Her mind raced, piecing together fragments of information. The buried photograph of the Harpers in front of the Greystone Diner, the article about the fatal robbery and arson, and now this, a hidden cache of identities and keepsakes buried in their yard like some long-forgotten secret. Jack frowned, examining the passport more closely. Look at this. His name here is Robert Lindell, not Frank Harper. And these ID cards, they're all for different aliases, Ellen added, flipping through them one by one. Each bore Frank's likeness, but a different name, address, and occupation. Whoever the Harpers were, they hadn't just changed locations. They'd reinvented themselves entirely. But why bury this stuff here? Jack wondered aloud, glancing toward the Harpers' house. If they wanted to leave their past behind, why not destroy it completely? Because they couldn't, Ellen said softly, her gaze fixed on the locket. Or because they thought they'd need it someday. Maybe they planned to come back for it, or maybe they hoped no one would ever find it. Her eyes drifted to the scorched edges of the locket, the faint smell of charred metal still lingering. Whatever fire had damaged it must have been intense, consuming everything around it. She thought of the diner in Greystone, reduced to ash decades ago. Could this locket have survived that blaze? And if so, what did it mean? The children in the photograph haunted her. Who were they? Relatives, victims, survivors? Their smiles seemed impossibly innocent, untouched by the darkness that now surrounded them. We need to figure out who they are, Ellen said firmly. closing the locket and tucking it into her pocket. These kids, they're the key to understanding what really happened. Jack hesitated, clearly uneasy. Ellen, we're playing with fire here. If the Harpers find out we've uncovered this, they won't, she interrupted, her tone resolute. Not unless we let them. But we can't ignore this, Jack. These people, they're hiding something big, something dangerous. And I think those kids are at the center of it. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. All right, but we do this carefully. No sudden moves, no confrontations. Agreed? Ellen nodded, though her mind was already racing ahead. This discovery changed everything. It wasn't just about solving a decades-old mystery anymore. It was about uncovering the truth behind the Harpers' carefully constructed facade. And whatever that truth was, it was buried deeper than either of them had imagined. As they carried the tin inside, Ellen couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of an abyss, one misstep away from unraveling secrets that someone had gone to great lengths to keep buried. Ellen waited until Jack had gone out for his morning walk before making the call. She sat at the kitchen table, the scorched locket resting on the polished wood in front of her, like a piece of evidence waiting to be examined. Her fingers traced its edges nervously as she dialed the number for the sheriff's office in Greystone, New Mexico, a number she'd found after hours spent scouring online directories. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Sheriff's office, Deputy Miller speaking. Hi, Ellen began, keeping her tone deliberately neutral. I'm calling about an old case, the fire at the Greystone Diner back in 1985. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a low chuckle. That case? You're not the first one to ask about it, ma'am. What's your interest? She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I came across something recently, something that might be connected. I'd rather not say more over the phone, but I think you'll want to hear what I've found. Another pause, this one longer and heavier. When Deputy Miller spoke again, his voice carried an edge of curiosity tinged with weariness. You've got my attention. Let me give you the number for Carl Hargrove. He worked the diner case back then. Retired now, but he's still obsessed with it. Leave him a message and he'll get back to you. Ellen scribbled down the number, thanked the deputy, and hung up. Her heart pounded as she dialed the second number, bracing herself for what might come next. This time the line clicked almost immediately. Carl Hargrove, a gravelly voice answered. Mr. Hargrove, thank you for taking my call, Ellen said quickly, gripping the receiver tightly. I'm calling because I believe I've found something related to the diner fire. Something important. Hargrove's tone shifted instantly, sharpening with interest. Go on. Ellen described the locket, the photograph inside, and the aliases they'd uncovered. She avoided mentioning the Harpers directly, instead focusing on the items themselves and their possible connection to the case. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Hargrove spoke, his voice low and deliberate. Does the locket have a small rose etched on the back? Ellen froze, her breath catching in her throat. She picked up the locket and turned it over, her eyes widening as she spotted the tiny rose engraved near the hinge, a detail she hadn't noticed before. Yes, she whispered. It does. Hargrove exhaled sharply, a sound that carried decades of frustration and longing. Then we may have finally found Rosa Morales. Ellen's pulse quickened. Rosa Morales? One of the missing victims, Hargrove explained, his voice thick with emotion. She was only 22 when she disappeared. Everyone assumed she died in the fire, but her body was never recovered. That locket, it belonged to her. She always wore it. Her family identified it from photos after the fire. Ellen's mind raced, connecting the dots. Rosa Morales, the children in the photograph, the aliases. It all pointed to a story far more complicated and tragic than she'd imagined. And the kids? She asked hesitantly. Do you know who they are? Hargrove sighed, the weight of years pressing down on him. They were Rosa's younger siblings, Maria and Diego. They lived with her after their parents passed away. Witnesses said they were at the diner that night, sitting in the back booth. Their bodies were never found either. Ellen felt a chill run through her as she stared at the photograph tucked inside the locket. Those smiling faces weren't just innocent bystanders. They were survivors, or perhaps victims, of a crime that had haunted Greystone for decades. "What happened to them?" she asked quietly. "That's the million-dollar question," Hargrove replied. "Some folks thought they ran off with whoever set the fire. Others believed they perished and were buried under the rubble. But without proof," his voice trailed off, heavy with regret. "If you found that locket, it means someone went to great lengths to hide it. And if Rosa or her siblings are alive, they've been living under new identities ever since." Ellen swallowed hard, glancing toward the window where the Harper's house loomed silently in the distance. "What should I do now?" "Keep it safe," Hargrove instructed firmly. "Don't let anyone know you found it. Not yet. If word gets out, whoever buried it will panic. And trust me, these kinds of secrets don't stay hidden without a reason." "I understand," Ellen said, though her mind was already spinning with possibilities. "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove, for everything." After hanging up, she sat motionless for several minutes, staring at the locket as if it might whisper its secrets if she listened closely enough. Rosa Morales, Maria and Diego. Names that had faded into history, but names that could tear apart the fragile piece of her quiet suburban life. When Jack returned from his walk, she didn't tell him about the call. Not right away. Instead, she tucked the locket into a small jewelry box and placed it in the back of her closet, hidden beneath a stack of sweaters. For now, it would remain safe, but she knew it wouldn't stay hidden forever. Because the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to surface. The knock at the door came just after sunset, soft but insistent. Ellen opened it to find Lila Harper standing on her porch, her usually impeccable appearance unraveled. Her silver hair was disheveled, her sweater askew, and her hands trembled as she clutched a glass of what smelled like whiskey. "Ellen," Lila whispered, her voice unsteady. "I need to talk to you." Ellen hesitated, her instincts screaming warnings, but something in Lila's eyes, raw vulnerability, mixed with desperation, made her step aside. "Come in." Lila stumbled into the living room, sinking onto the edge of the couch as if her legs might give out beneath her. She took a shaky sip from her glass before setting it down on the coffee table. The silence between them stretched taut until Lila finally spoke. "My name isn't Lila Harper," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's Rosa Morales. I was 24 when everything happened." Ellen's breath caught. She had suspected, yes, but hearing it confirmed aloud sent a jolt through her chest. "Rosa," she murmured, testing the name. "The diner fire." Rosa nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "My parents owned the diner. It was our family business, a place where everyone gathered. That night, God, it feels like yesterday." Her voice cracked and she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "They came in late, masked and armed. They tied us up, demanded the safe be open. My father tried to reason with them, but they didn't care. They wanted money and revenge." "Revenge?" Ellen prompted gently, perching on the armchair across from her. Rosa nodded again, her gaze distant, as if reliving the nightmare. "Years earlier, my brother Diego got into trouble with some bad people, drug dealers, loan sharks. He owed them money he couldn't pay back. When they came for him, my parents refused to let them take him. They threatened us, said they'd make us pay one way or another. We thought we were safe after Diego left town, but they found us anyway." She paused, taking another sip of whiskey to steady herself. "Frank, he wasn't Frank then. His real name is Robert Lindell. He worked part-time at the diner, helping my dad with repairs. That night, he managed to free himself while the robbers argued over splitting the cash. He untied me, and we tried to get to Maria and Diego. They were hiding in the back booth. But the fire spread so fast." Her voice broke, and she covered her face with hands, shoulders shaking silently. Ellen waited, unsure whether to comfort her or demand answers. Finally, Rosa looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but blazing with resolve. "They say we started the fire," she continued, her words tumbling out now. "But it wasn't us. One of the robbers dropped a cigarette near the gas line. It ignited before anyone could stop it. We didn't have time to save everyone. Frank and I barely made it out alive. We thought the kids were right behind us, but her voice faltered again, grief overwhelming her. Ellen leaned forward, her heart pounding. What happened to Maria and Diego? We don't know, Rosa cried, anguish etched into every line of her face. We searched for days, weeks, even months, but there was no sign of them. Everyone assumed they died in the fire, but we couldn't believe it. We wouldn't believe it. So we ran, to protect ourselves, yes, but also because we hoped someday we'd find proof they were alive. And Frank? Ellen asked softly. He stayed with you all these years? Rosa smiled faintly, though it was tinged with sadness. Robert, Frank, is the only person who never doubted me, who never stopped looking for answers. Over time, we built new lives, new identities. But the guilt, the fear, she shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. It never goes away. Every move we made, every lie we told, it was to survive, to keep hoping. Ellen sat back, absorbing the weight of Rosa's confession. This woman, the polite, reserved neighbor she'd once found so unsettling, was carrying decades of trauma, loss, and secrets far heavier than Ellen had imagined. What about the locket? Ellen asked finally. Why bury it here? Rosa's expression darkened. When we moved in, I thought this would be our final home, a place to start fresh. But I couldn't bring myself to destroy the locket. It was all I had left of Maria and Diego. Burying it felt safer than keeping it close. Safer for us, and for anyone else who might stumble upon it. Ellen nodded slowly, piecing together the fragments of Rosa's story. It was tragic, yes, but it didn't absolve them entirely. You lied to us, she said quietly, about your names, about moving here recently. Why didn't you trust us? Trust doesn't come easily when you've lived a lie for 40 years, Rosa replied, her voice heavy with regret. We weren't sure who you were, what you might uncover. And now, she trailed off, glancing toward the window as if expecting someone or something to appear. Ellen followed her gaze, dread pooling in her stomach. Does Frank know you're here? Telling me this? No, Rosa admitted, her trembling intensifying. And he can't. If he finds out... She swallowed hard, unable to finish the sentence. Before Ellen could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from outside. Heavy, deliberate steps crossing the porch. The doorknob rattled, and Rosa froze, her eyes wide with terror. Stay quiet, Ellen whispered urgently, rising to intercept whoever was coming. But as the door creaked open, revealing Robert, standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, Ellen realized the truth was about to unravel even further. The room seemed to shrink as Robert stepped inside, his sharp gaze flicking between Rosa and Ellen. For a moment, no one spoke, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Robert closed the door behind him, his movements deliberate, almost mechanical. You shouldn't have come here, he said to Rosa, his voice low but laced with steel. It wasn't anger, it was fear, pure, unrelenting fear. Rosa stood shakily, clutching her glass like a lifeline. I had to, Robert. She knows too much already. Robert's eyes locked onto Ellen, narrowing slightly. And you've told her everything, haven't you? Not everything, Rosa whispered, her voice trembling. Just the truth. For a long moment, Robert didn't move. He simply stared at them, his jaw tightening, as if wrestling with some internal battle. Finally, he sighed, a sound heavy with resignation, and sank into the chair opposite Ellen. If she knows this much, he said quietly, then maybe it's time she heard the rest. Ellen leaned forward, her pulse racing. This was the moment she'd been chasing since finding the photograph in her yard. The truth, not just fragments, not just guesses, but the whole story. Greystone, New Mexico, October 1985. It had been an ordinary evening. Rosa Morales clocked out of the diner early, leaving her younger siblings, Maria and Diego, to finish their homework in the back booth while her parents closed up for the night. She promised to return later to pick up her paycheck. Frank, then known as Robert Lindell, offered to tag along, saying he needed to grab a toolbox he'd left under the counter. When they arrived back at the diner, the parking lot was eerily empty. No customers lingered over coffee, no cars idled by the curb. Something felt off, though neither could pinpoint why. As they approached the entrance, the faint murmur of voices drifted through the cracked open door. Inside, chaos reigned. Two masked men loomed over Rosa's father, shouting demands about the safe. Her mother cowered nearby, tears streaming down her face. Maria and Diego were nowhere to be seen. Frank reacted first, grabbing Rosa's arm and pulling her behind a stack of crates near the kitchen. They watched in horror as the robbers rifled through the cash register, their tempers flaring when they realized how little money there was. One of them, a tall, wiry man with a scar slicing across his knuckles, slammed his fist on the counter. "This is bullshit," he snarled. "Where's the rest of it?" "They don't have it," Rosa's father shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Please, take what's here and go." The second man, a burly figure with cold, dead eyes, pulled a lighter from his pocket, flicking it open and closed menacingly. "Maybe we'll leave a message instead." That's when things spiraled out of control. As the first man lit a cigarette, the lighter slipped from his fingers, sparking against the exposed gas line beneath the stove. Within seconds, flames erupted, spreading faster than anyone could react. Smoke filled the air, choking screams drowned out by the roar of fire. Frank sprang into action, untangling himself from the crates and rushing toward Rosa's parents. "We need to get out," he yelled, his voice barely audible over the chaos. But Rosa hesitated, scanning the room frantically. "Maria! Diego!" she screamed, her voice breaking. "Where are they?" Her mother pointed weakly toward the walk-in freezer. "Diego hid in there. They're safe." Without thinking, Rosa bolted for the freezer, Frank close behind. Inside, huddled together and shaking, were Maria and Diego. Tears streamed down their faces as Rosa scooped them into her arms. "We have to go," Frank urged, tugging at Rosa's sleeve. The heat was unbearable now, the flames licking at the walls. They burst out of the freezer just as the ceiling began to collapse. Frank grabbed Diego, hoisting the boy onto his shoulders, while Rosa clutched Maria tightly. Together they staggered toward the exit, the smoke burning their lungs with every step. Behind them, the diner crumbled into an inferno. The two masked men fled the scene, disappearing into the night without a trace. The aftermath. By the time emergency responders arrived, the diner was nothing more than ash and rubble. Bodies were recovered, or so they thought. Rosa's parents were identified among the victims, but Maria and Diego were nowhere to be found. Witnesses claimed they saw Rosa and Frank fleeing the scene with a young boy in tow. The police pieced together a narrative that painted Rosa and Frank as the culprits. Why else would they run? Why else would they vanish without reporting the crime? Terrified and grief-stricken, Rosa and Frank made a decision. They would disappear. Not because they were guilty, but because staying meant risking arrest, imprisonment, or worse. And deep down they clung to hope. Diego might still be alive. Maybe Maria too. So they ran, changing names, shedding identities, burying their pasts like relics in unmarked graves. All the while searching for answers, for closure, for the siblings who had vanished alongside the truth. Back in the present, Robert finished speaking, his voice raw with emotion. "We never meant to hurt anyone," he said, looking directly at Ellen. "We just wanted to survive." Ellen sat motionless, her mind reeling. The pieces fit together now. The aliases, the locked garage, the buried locket. Rosa and Robert weren't murderers. They were survivors. But survival came at a cost, and the weight of their choices had followed them for decades. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Ellen glanced at Rosa, whose tear-streaked face mirrored the exhaustion etched into Robert's. "What happens now?" Ellen asked softly. Rosa met her gaze, her expression resolute despite the tears. "Now we find my brother." The next morning, Ellen sat at her kitchen table with the jewelry box open in front of her. The locket gleamed faintly in the soft light streaming through the window, its tiny rose catching the sun. Inside it, the photograph of Maria and Diego seemed to stare back at her, their smiles frozen in time. She picked up her phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing Carl Hargrove's number. It rang twice before his gravelly voice answered. Hargrove. It's Ellen, she said quietly, glancing toward the living room to ensure Jack wasn't within earshot. I've got something you need to see. The locket, the IDs, everything. I think it'll help confirm Rosa's story. There was a pause on the other end, heavy with unspoken implications. You're sure about this? Hargrove asked finally. Once I have those items, there's no turning back. If they pan out, and if your neighbor really is Rosa Morales, this could blow the case wide open. I know, Ellen replied, her voice steady despite the knot tightening in her stomach. But we owe it to her, to them, to everyone who's been searching for answers all these years. Another long silence followed. When Hargrove spoke again, his tone carried a weight of determination. All right, send me what you got, but listen carefully. I'll keep Rosa's identity under wraps until we can verify her claims. If she's telling the truth, she deserves that much. Thank you, Ellen murmured, relief washing over her. She ended the call and immediately began packing the locket and IDs into a padded envelope. As she sealed it shut, her mind raced ahead to the next step. Later that afternoon, while Jack was busy tinkering in the garage, Ellen slipped away to the post office. She mailed the envelope to Hargrove first, ensuring it would reach him by priority mail. Then, heart pounding, she stopped at a nearby pharmacy to purchase a DNA collection kit, one designed for genealogy testing. Back home, she carefully swabbed the inside of the locket where traces of skin cells might still linger. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the sample into the prepaid envelope provided by the testing service. Underneath the sender information, she wrote her own name, not Rosa's. If anyone traced the test back, it would lead to her, not the Harpers. As she dropped the second envelope into the mailbox, a wave of guilt washed over her. What she was doing felt invasive, almost voyeuristic, but deep down she knew it was necessary. The locket held secrets far older than any of them, and unlocking those secrets might finally bring closure to Rosa, and perhaps to Maria and Diego, wherever they were. That evening, Ellen found herself unable to sit still. Every creak of the floorboards made her glance toward the door, half expecting Rosa or Robert to appear and demand answers. But the house remained quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional bark of a distant dog. Jack wandered into the kitchen, frowning at her restless pacing. What's gotten into you today? You've been acting strange all week. Ellen forced a smile, though it felt brittle. Just thinking about the Harpers, about everything they've been through. He sighed, leaning against the counter. I know you want to help them, Ellen, but don't lose sight of the bigger picture here. These people are carrying decades of baggage. No matter how much you dig, some wounds never heal. His words lingered in her mind long after he left the room. He was right, of course. Some scars ran too deep to fade completely. But Rosa and Robert weren't just victims. They were survivors. And survivors deserved a chance to rewrite their stories, even if only in small ways. Over the next few days, Ellen kept a close eye on the Harpers' house. Rosa appeared more withdrawn than usual, rarely venturing outside except to tend to the garden. Robert, on the other hand, seemed agitated, pacing near the windows late at night like a man waiting for something, or someone, to arrive. One afternoon, Rosa approached Ellen as she watered the flowers along the fence line. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Did you send anything? She asked softly, her voice barely audible. Ellen hesitated, then nodded. Just the locket and IDs, to someone who can help verify your story. I promised they'd keep your identity secret until we know more. Rosa exhaled shakily, clutching the edge of the fence for support. Thank you, she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. For believing me, for giving us a chance. Ellen reached out, placing a gentle hand on Rosa's arm. You've carried this burden alone for far too long. Let me help you carry it now. Rosa managed a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. And the DNA test? Did you? Ellen shook her head. Not yet, but soon. We'll find Diego, Rosa. I promise. As Rosa turned to leave, Ellen watched her retreat into the house, her heart aching with a mixture of hope and dread. The pieces were falling into place, but the puzzle was far from complete. Somewhere out there, answers waited. and with them, the possibility of redemption or ruin. The email notification arrived late one evening, blinking innocuously on Ellen's laptop screen. She sat at the kitchen table, the house quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Her heart raced as she opened the message from the genealogy testing service, her fingers trembling slightly over the mouse. The results were clear and devastatingly conclusive. Rosa Morales was indeed who she claimed to be. More importantly, the DNA sample taken from the locket matched a man named Daniel Harper, a 48-year-old living just 3 hours away in Colorado Springs. According to public records, Daniel had been adopted as an infant after being found abandoned outside a hospital shortly after the diner fire. His birth name? Diego Morales. Ellen stared at the screen, her breath catching in her throat. After 4 decades of searching, of living in fear and grief, Rosa's brother was alive and within reach. But the revelation wasn't without its complications. The truth would change everything, for Rosa, for Robert, and perhaps even for Daniel himself. The next morning, Ellen waited until Jack left for his usual coffee run before knocking softly on the Harper's door. Rosa answered almost immediately, her face pale but composed. When she saw the look in Ellen's eyes, however, her composure crumbled. "It's him," Ellen said gently, stepping inside. "Diego. He's alive, living under the name Daniel Harper." Rosa staggered back, clutching the edge of the couch for support. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she sank into the cushions, her hands trembling uncontrollably. "Alive," she whispered, shaking her head as if trying to process the impossible. "All these years. I thought he was gone." Robert appeared moments later, drawn by commotion. His expression darkened when he saw Rosa's tears, but before he could speak, Ellen handed him a printout of the genealogy report. He scanned it quickly, his jaw tightening with each passing second. "This can't be real," he muttered, though there was no mistaking the hope flickering in his eyes. "If this is true—" "It's true," Ellen assured him, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I double-checked everything. The adoption records align with the timeline of the fire. It's him." For a long moment, none of them spoke. Rosa buried her face in her hands, sobs racking her body as Robert knelt beside her, holding her tightly. Ellen stepped back, giving them space to absorb the enormity of what they'd learned. Finally, Rosa looked up, her tear-streaked face etched with determination. "We have to find him," she said hoarsely. "We have to tell him the truth." Later that afternoon, Ellen received another call from Carl Hargrove. His voice was tinged with both triumph and sorrow as he relayed the final piece of the puzzle. "The real culprits were caught years ago," he explained. "Both men served time for unrelated crimes, armed robbery and manslaughter. But the diner case never connected to them because investigators assumed Rosa and Frank were responsible. Without bodies or evidence proving otherwise, the case went cold." Ellen listened intently, her mind racing. "So Rosa and Robert were innocent all along?" "Innocent victims of circumstance," Hargrove corrected grimly. "They ran because they had no choice. And now," he paused, exhaling heavily, "now we finally have enough to close the book on this tragedy. For good." Ellen thanked him, promising to share the news with Rosa and Robert once they were ready. As she hung up, she felt a strange mix of relief and unease. Justice might finally be served, but the scars left behind would take far longer to heal. That evening, Ellen returned to the Harper's home, this time bearing the full weight of the truth. Rosa and Robert sat together on the couch, their faces pale but resolute. "The men who did this, they're already in prison," Ellen began carefully. "They were caught for other crimes years ago, but no one ever linked them to the diner fire. Until now." Rosa's hands flew to her mouth, fresh tears streaming down her face. "So it's over," she whispered. "After all these years." "It's not just over," Robert added quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "It's vindication. For Rosa, for us, for everyone who doubted us." Ellen nodded, her own eyes glistening. "And Daniel is waiting. You'll need to decide how to approach him. But he deserves to know the truth. About you, about Maria, about everything. Rosa reached out, gripping Ellen's hand tightly. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice breaking, "for believing in us, for finding him." As Ellen left the house, the cool night air wrapped around her like a comforting embrace. Behind her, the Harper's lights burned brightly against the darkness. A beacon of hope after decades of shadows. But the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Reuniting Diego with his sister meant reopening old wounds, confronting painful memories that had festered for too long. Yet somehow Ellen knew they were strong enough to face it. Together. Because sometimes the hardest truths are also the ones that set us free. The day of the reunion dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the windows of Ellen's home. She moved quietly around the kitchen, preparing coffee and setting out a tray of pastries. Jack had already taken his tools to the backyard, where the old wooden fence between their property and the Harpers stood weathered and warped, a relic of boundaries that no longer needed to exist. Rosa arrived first, her hands trembling as she clutched a small photo album close to her chest. Ellen greeted her warmly, leading her to the living room where they could sit and wait together. For once, Rosa's usual composure was gone. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but there was a light in them that hadn't been there before, a spark of hope after decades of darkness. "He's coming," Rosa whispered, more to herself than to Ellen. "After all these years," Ellen reached over, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "He's your brother, Rosa. No matter what happens today, nothing can take that away." Moments later, a car pulled into the driveway. Daniel Harper, or Diego Morales, as he'd once been known, stepped out, his expression cautious but curious. He was tall, with dark hair streaked with gray, and features that bore an uncanny resemblance to Rosa. As he approached the door, Rosa rose unsteadily, clutching the photo album like a lifeline. When Ellen opened the door, Daniel hesitated, glancing at Rosa uncertainly. But then their eyes met, and something shifted, something deep and primal, as if decades of separation dissolved in an instant. Rosa took a hesitant step forward, holding out the album. "This is you," she said softly, her voice breaking. "And Maria, and me. We thought we'd lost you, but here you are." Daniel stared at the photographs, his hands shaking as he flipped through them. Tears welled in his eyes as he looked up at Rosa, recognition dawning across his face. "You're my sister," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I remember now. The diner, the fire. I didn't understand it then, but I do now." Rosa stepped closer, wrapping her arms around him in a fierce embrace. They held each other tightly, tears streaming down both their faces as 40 years of silence and loss melted away. Ellen stepped back, giving them space, her own heart swelling with a mix of joy and relief. Outside, Jack worked steadily, dismantling the rotting fence board by board. By the time Rosa and Daniel emerged from the house, blinking in the sunlight, the barrier between the two properties lay in pieces on the ground. Seeing them standing side by side, siblings reunited after so many years, Jack paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "It was time for this thing to come down," he said simply, gesturing to the pile of splintered wood. "No sense keeping fences up when there's nothing left to hide." Rosa smiled faintly, her arms still linked with Daniel's. "Thank you, Jack. For everything." Frank, Robert, appeared behind them, his expression softening as he watched Rosa and Daniel talk quietly, sharing fragments of memories long buried. Ellen noticed how he lingered just slightly apart, as if unsure of his place in this new chapter of their lives. But when Rosa turned to beckon him closer, he stepped forward without hesitation, joining the circle. For the first time in decades, they weren't running. They weren't hiding. They were simply living. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Ellen and Jack stood on their porch watching the Harpers, now truly themselves, unpack folding chairs and set out a picnic table in their yard. Laughter echoed through the air as Daniel recounted stories from his life, while Rosa listened intently, nodding and smiling through tears. "They've been carrying that weight for so long," Jack said softly, leaning against the railing. Feels good to see them finally let it go. Ellen nodded, her gaze fixed on the open space where the fence used to stand. Sometimes the hardest part isn't finding the truth. It's learning to live with it. But they're survivors, Jack. Always have been. As twilight settled over the neighborhood, the four figures sat together under the stars, silhouetted against the warm glow of lanterns. The scars of the past would always remain, but tonight they were surrounded by something stronger. Family, friendship, and the quiet promise of a future unburdened by fear. In the distance, Max barked playfully, chasing shadows cast by the flickering lights. Ellen smiled, reaching for Jack's hand. Life wasn't perfect, but it was whole, and sometimes that was enough.